All right, we're back. We have Mr. Andy Hutchins on the line. Andy, how you doing today?
I'm good. How you doing, Jared?
Good. Excited to talk about switchgrass this morning. We have our good friend, Mr. Roger Sampson on. How you doing, Roger?
Great, Jared.
Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So before we hit the record button, you were just complimenting us on our Detroit Lions. Is that right?
Well, I just think that it's my team. It's the closest team to where I live, and we know they've been down, and we know they're coming up, and that I think next year they're going to come up a little bit higher. I hope.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, we all hope the same thing. And I guess let's start this out. You said it's pretty cold where you're at. Let's hear about, who you are, where you're from. If anybody's been in the switchgrass world the last couple of years, they've probably heard you or seen you in your group. But for those who may not have been familiar, let's learn about Roger.
Well, I'm an Aggie at heart. Like I come at this from the agricultural side, and I really had a big interest in regenerative agriculture, and that got me interested in native grasses. And so it's more than a 30-year project for us now, growing these native grasses. And we've grown them in, worked with partners to develop them in North America. And I've worked a lot overseas as well with grasses in the Philippines with sugarcane, and in both temperate and tropical climates overseas as well. So I've been to about 30 countries on missions through my professional work. So but I'm a nature lover at heart, and so it's easy for me to understand the habitat sector because I've done a lot of nature observation of like moose and deer in the forests and landscape here.
Wow. 30 countries. That's pretty awesome. What was one of the coolest things you saw abroad in your studies?
Well, I mean, I've been in some pretty difficult places like South Sudan. Okay, so like being on the Upper Nile and doing a walk-in safari, like that's about as intense as it gets, with a couple of guys with guns protecting you against the wildlife, and it took us two trips to get in there because we were blocked by the police on our first trip, because just the way the country is, it's a very delicate situation. So I was actually hired there by the Canadian government to go in and help the food security situation in the country. And man, if you want like people that worship, like livestock, those are the guys. They're just they're just real livestock people. So it's
Interesting.
so it's pretty interesting. Every country you go to, you get different lessons. But that was probably the most intense and different. And I'm
Well,
not going back.
and you're in Montreal now, you said, correct?
Yeah, I grew up in Southern Ontario, and then I decided to study at McGill University, and I just decided to stay.
Okay. Very nice. So, and in the switchgrass side of things, with your whole background, how many years have you spent studying varieties of switchgrass or developing varieties of switchgrass alone, or specifically?
Well, believe it or not, I during university I did a term paper on switchgrass, and that would have been 40 years ago.
Wow.
So that was my first exposure, and I said, "Wow, what an interesting plant," And then I went on a Midwest tour with our university, and we were the whole class went on a bus for 2 weeks, and we got into the Midwest, and we saw like switchgrass in Kentucky on mine spoils, and so I had some exposure early, and then later on, when the farm crisis hit in the early '90s, um, we were looking for a solution, and the best solution was to diversify the farm sector and with these biomass crops for renewable energy and renewable fibers. And lo and behold, the switchgrass came up as a promising species. So I toured the US and visited all the scientists, like especially in the northern US. I went out to South Dakota and we went all around and learned as much as we could about the crop and attended a lot of meetings. And gradually, I'm kind of the top person on upland switchgrass now. Everybody else is retired.
Wow.
But it's a great crop to work with because it doesn't need a lot of care. And we run pretty much the biggest research program on upland switchgrass in the world, and we're a pretty small team.
So to say you might be one of the guys when it comes to to the
Yeah,
switchgrass
everybody else is
world.
retired,
Yeah.
So we started really intensively about 2006 when George Bush put switchgrass in his State of the Union address about it as a way to solve the U.S. energy crisis with cellulosic ethanol. So we were already on the cellulosic ethanol story for 15 years. And so it was natural for the farmers that we were working with to say, well, let's get into switchgrass. And so one of the farmers, who was a big farmer, he once farmed 12,000 acres. Don Knott is his name, and he's our main seed grower. He planted 350 acres of switchgrass to try it. Okay, so that was his idea of how to start trying switchgrass, was plant 350 acres without government subsidies.
Wow.
So the farmers are risk takers when they see an opportunity, and they saw switchgrass as a promising crop. And the farmers love it because it's so easy to grow, and there's very little risk involved. It's always there for you. So, even dairy farmers tell me that it's always there. So it's a great crop for habitat because, once you plant it, it's there, and what we've tried to do is improve the genetics of the crop and improve the agronomy of the crop, because people were planting like 50-year-old varieties, and they were, making big mistakes on herbicides and timing, and just over mowing it. So I saw this sector and I said, oh my, look at that. They mow, spray, wait, mow, spray, wait, mow, spray, wait. That was the process for 3 years. And I said, wow, that's just, you got to get results. So if you can get results in the first year and get switchgrass up to 6 feet the first year and get deer bedding in it the first year, like, you're getting the results. So our goal is really to make this crop easier to grow and more pleasurable for people, that they get results earlier.
Now, what are the farmers growing it for? Are they, I mean, for seed, or is there an actual, uh, use for it in like the crop world?
Well, the main uses we have in Eastern Canada are the dairy sector. We don't have much of a beef sector here. Historically, there's been a lot of use in the Midwest for grazing. And here in Eastern Canada, we mainly use it for like dry cow feed for dairy cattle and for bedding. It's a hygienic bedding, so the cows tend to get less mastitis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Andy, you have switchgrass on your farm. I have switchgrass on my old parcel. Roger, we'll give you just a little bit of a intro on where we're at in the process, which is not as high of a level as you. Andy, what do you have planted, and how long has that been there for?
I'm on year 3 with some, I think it's Cavid Rock,
Yeah.
switchgrass, and I'm having some results, but I'm not having great results by any means.
And how did you plant that?
I overseeded.
Like frost seeded?
Yeah, yep.
Okay. And I was the same way. I did some cave and rock for 3, 4 years ago. Had pretty good results with frost seeding only, with a fall spray preparation and then frost seeding. So you mentioned it's easy to grow. A lot of the things we hear about are, people fussing about all the preparation and how it's so delicate and all the steps you have to go through. Can you expound a little bit on what you mean by easy to grow?
Well, like Cave Rock, for example, is a 50-year-old variety, and it wasn't even bred. It was just found. So they
Okay.
found it in a prairie remnant in southern Illinois on the Ohio, near the Ohio River, just above Kentucky, and they called it Cave Rock. They found two plants and they multiplied them up. That's Cave Rock. So you're dealing with a wild, unimproved species. And what we've done is we've domesticated it like a real crop, and basically applied modern breeding techniques like agriculture specialists do to make it a field crop. And our objective was just to let's just breed this up to make it a field crop. And all of a sudden, like about 4 or 5 years ago, when we started selling seed, we started getting calls from the habitat sector. We're like, what's that habitat? What's that? And then it was like, oh yeah, deer screening bedding. Oh, that sounds pretty good. Because we were breeding them to be tall and erect, mostly for biofibers and bioethanol. So our program was not for breeding for habitat, but we had the ideotype. We had the best sort of species type that it wouldn't lodge, and it got taller and it got bigger and it grew really fast. So, some of the native grass specialists will say that our materials have exceptional seedling vigor if you compare them to like cave and rock. So the one that's our biggest seller, and which has kind of taken over the North American market for habitat use, is this RC Big Rock, which has been bred out of cave and rock.
Okay.
So it's not the new, it's just a better version of the good old cave and rock. And there's really nothing that cave and rock does better than Big Rock. And we kind of labeled it Big Rock, Cave and Rock. Kind of people kind of tie them together. And Cave and Rock is what we started with. We tested all the varieties here. We tested about a dozen varieties from across the Midwest and from the northern Great Plains. And we saw Cave and Rock was pretty productive here, but had a lot of gaps. It was slow to get going. And one of our farmers that we first started growing with, he kind of laughed at it and said, "You're going to turn that into a field crop because it still looked like nothing after 4 weeks." And that was a pretty tough lesson to take. When somebody laughs at your research project and says like, "You're wasting my time." So we listened to the farmers, and if they say they want it easier to grow, we worked on the seedling vigor hard. And like we have new genetics that we have that'll get it over 6 feet every year. So the RC Big Rock will get pretty close to 6 feet on a decent site with proper habitat management.
Okay. That sounds great compared to something unimproved and 50 years old. What does RC stand for in RC Big Rock?
It stands for REAP Canada. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So we started with the name Resource Efficient Agricultural Production.
Got it.
Something around like kind of regenerative ag thing. And then nobody wanted to say REAP Canada, Big Rock. And they all started calling it RC, RC, RC. And so we said, well, I guess let's call it RC.
Okay.
Because
Appreciate that.
yeah, and it's easy to say and it's easy to remember. And like at least in variety releases in Canada, everybody puts the institution in abbreviation in front of it. So we now have 4 varieties that we've introduced RC switchgrasses.
And what were the other 3?
The other 3 are RC Chippewa, which is a little bit shorter season, more for like the farming sector, we feel. And we had RC Tecumseh. You might have heard of that one. It's been out for a few years and it does super well in frost seeding. And so if you're in like the northern Corn Belt, and you might want to mix RC Tecumseh with the RC Big Rock because it does super well in frost seeding situations.
Okay.
And it's originally from eastern Nebraska. There's a town there called Tecumseh, Nebraska, in southeastern Nebraska, and that's where the seed was originally discovered. And we've bred it up from another variety that was released called Summer. But it originates in that hot, dry climate. And when we put it back there, like, 80 years later, it's working really nice. So the RC Tecumseh is really good in the central Great Plains. And then we have a new one that's called RC Sundance. And that's newly released this year in the US. And it's a cross between Sunburst, which is historically was the most popular variety in the northern Great Plains, with Cave and Rock, but elite breeding lines of Cave and Rock. And so it's Sundance from Sunburst. And it's already our second best seller. And we have a lot of hope for that one, both in the farm sector and the habitat sector. But it's more northerly than the Big Rock. It's about 12 days earlier. So it'll take the heat and the drought and the short season environment. Whereas Big Rock is really like, Midwest, very well adapted to the Midwest. It originated in Southern Illinois.
Awesome. What now let's say somebody they want to put in a switch plot switchgrass. I can't talk right now. Switchgrass plot starting from the beginning. How would you do that? What would be your suggestions on that, Roger?
Well, I think there's really two scenarios. One is the tilled scenario where you've got existing food plots, and the best setup crop would probably be soybeans. So the best results with a frost seed into soybean stubble, you can't beat it. Nice and simple, nothing to do, really nothing to do. You could put like a Roundup and 2,4-D late in the year onto the soybeans, or you may just do nothing because the site's already well controlled to perennial weeds. And then you would frost seed probably just when the snow's, melting out. So maybe like mid-March for most people in your listening area. And then you'd probably want to put some simazine on there when you can get on, and probably about the last week of April. You don't want to really put it out too early, or it can leach and be degraded when your annual grasses are growing. So that's a problem. Some people put their simazine out too early. Some people put too much. You got to respect the label rates, and that like some people think their objective is to teach the weeds a lesson. And that's just the wrong way to grow switchgrass. You want to grow switchgrass. You don't want to teach the weeds a lesson, or you're going to have some pretty sad looking stunted switchgrass the first year. So that's a major problem, is bad information and bad agronomy, and don't teach the weeds a lesson is the number one switchgrass growing tip. You're growing switchgrass. You got to tolerate some weeds, and you got to be gentle on the switchgrass. So we tell people to put 2 quarts per acre of simazine out, and that's not going to be harmful on the switchgrass, and that's going to really set your weeds back. And usually with a vigorous switchgrass like Big Rock, you don't need to do anything afterwards if you've got a reasonably clean site. You might need one clipping, like once it's growing, you can clip the weeds above the switchgrass. Or if you're really in a nasty scenario, you can use something like quinclorac. But quinclorac's like $60 an acre. Like, don't plan to use quinclorac. Plan to put enough seed out there to get a great stand and put the right rate of simazine on, trust the genetics, and if you've got a problem, you can clip. And if you really, really like got a filthy field, you can spray quinclorac. But I think too many guys are I would say, like, going a little bit cheap on the seed, and then they pay the price on extra herbicides. And
Makes a lot of sense.
whatever, people's views are on it, like herbicides are not good for biodiversity, and they're certainly not good for human health if you get a lot of exposure over time. So as an Aggie, I see these guys on their four-wheelers doing spraying through the spray, and overlapping, and no protective equipment. Like, that's something that people really need to be conscious of. Is just get a pair of coveralls, cover yourself up, put on some gloves, put on a mask, and you're done. And put enough seed out there so that the crop actually suppresses the weeds because it's growing so quickly.
That makes sense. So when it comes to the broadcast method, if you will, whether you're frost seeding or not, you really want the preparation to be done correctly. Get yourself a clean slate, weed free as possible.
Yeah.
Clean site, you called it.
Yeah, I would say like you really got to prep the site if it's an old field conversion. Like that's a much more challenging environment and higher risk. So ideally you're going to start like halfway through the previous year, spray it a couple of times with Roundup and 2,4-D. Have one last spraying around, like, let's say mid-October. So you cleaned up all your winter annuals. And then you got a site you can work with, and you can no-till into it or frost seed into it the next spring, and not have a flush of perennials come at you. So people need to just plan a little bit, and they can't just kind of wing it, especially in an old field conversion. And, there was this disastrous strategy of just plant and spray Roundup before your seed emerges. And like our seed just grows, it grows quickly. So like we just like think that that's like old advice for old varieties. And if you got a modern variety, you got to get your ducks in a row and do your prep the year before, and
Yep.
we call it Russian roulette farming, when you're spraying Roundup after you put seed on the ground. Like that's no way to get a stand established.
Yeah, it's pretty risky too with how expensive the seed can be as well. So it would behoove us to prep ahead of time. And that's how I did it before. I did a fall, spring, a couple of them, late summer and fall, and it worked great. I'd
Yeah.
enjoy that.
Well, that's it, because the plant is the way it works is that when you apply Roundup in the fall, the plant is storing its energy for the winter to survive. So it pulls that Roundup down into the roots. And so it kills it quite nicely. But if you apply it in the spring, the energy is coming from the roots and it's going against what you want. The plant is trying to grow up and you want your herbicide to go down, and your herbicide doesn't go down. So you mostly just get top kill. So like fall Roundup applications are just so much better than spring applications.
Okay. Here's a question for you from one of our listeners. I've heard guys talk about, trying to be herbicide free and all that. Can you establish switchgrass without any chemicals? And if
Yeah,
so, how?
well, we've had like farmers establish it on as big an acreage as 90 acres, no chemicals. Okay. And mostly what people will do is have a good setup crop. So probably the best setup crops are like an alfalfa crop, where it's been in about 3 or 4 years and it's rotated out. That's pretty clean for annual weeds usually. And if you just drill into that and do one clipping or two clippings, you can get a stand with RC Big Rock. We're confident of that. Another way people do it is they'll till the previous summer and then they'll plant a fall cover crop. Okay, so you get your food crop, and the benefit of that. And then in the spring, you could just disc it in and plant. And don't, like, we talk about a planting range of 6 to 10 pound per acre. Well, if you want to go no chemicals, you want to go up on the higher end of that range.
Sure.
So 10 pound per acre. Put enough seed out there so you get pretty good competition from the crop. So I think it's totally doable with our new varieties. Like if you're planting a lowland switchgrass like Alamo, that is like, just miserable for establishment. Yeah, good luck to you with no chemicals, I think. So it's all a matter of get a vigorous switchgrass and do some prepping, and I think it's doable. Yeah.
Roger, what soils are the best for growing this?
Well, I would say like the best corn soils are the best switchgrass soils.
Okay.
But what's really nice is that like pretty marginal soils will still get you a great crop of switchgrass. You know, not as high as a good corn soil. A good corn soil will push it up 9 feet, but it'll still get to 6.5, 7 feet on a fairly low fertility soil. So I would say for most habitat managers, they're not using prime farmland for habitat. They're using marginal lands. So switchgrass is a great crop. And if you do annuals for screening, over time you're beating up your soils, especially if they're marginal soils. So why not plant a perennial that's going to improve the soil over time? Like the richest soils in the world evolved under prairie grasses like switchgrass. So it's a great soil. It's a great soil builder. It's really a great way to restore fertility. Like let's say you had a worn out farm, you could put it into
That's what I have. That's what
yeah.
we're doing right now.
Yeah, see, that's typical. So you could plant a block of switchgrass and make sure that you got some lanes in there and some food plots. And then you could put that down for like 6 or 7 years, restore the soil fertility in that section, and then take another section you have in food plots and put it into switchgrass. So it could be a long way to build up your farm. But switchgrass is pretty much like they use it for mine reclamation where there's no soil. So you know that the plant is resource efficient. And we breed all our switchgrass with no fertilizers. And we try to go on less than best farmlands to grow it for a breeding program. So we don't babysit our switchgrass. We let it just like struggle. And all the bad plants disappear and all the good plants stay. And I learned about this following rice breeding programs in the Philippines. And we had rice breeders that were breeding on these really crappy lands. And they saw that like certain plants would emerge and others would go away. So not babysitting switchgrass as a breeder is probably one of the reasons why our materials are so good. We force the plant to evolve efficient mechanisms to take up water and nutrients.
Yeah, you make it work harder, deeper roots, find the
Mhm.
water versus just watering it and letting them think they're all
Yeah,
good.
and the beauty of this is that it makes the plants really widely adapted, so it never bombs. And what makes a great variety of crop, whether it's soybeans or anything else, is it never bombs. Nobody likes spending money and getting a bad result, or else you develop a super bad reputation. So we're very fortunate that we've evolved these switchgrasses that, like, especially the big rock, it's adapted from like eastern Nebraska to Nova Scotia. Widely adapted. It's growing well in northern Georgia. So broad adaptability and adaptability to marginal soils are great traits.
Okay.
How about beach sand? How's it growing beach sand?
Yeah, if you're in beach sand in Michigan, just be a little bit patient and it's going to come. Okay. And like we have the RC Tecumseh, and it's more drought tolerant. It has narrower leaves, and it's heat tolerant, and it does really well on light soils in Michigan, especially northern Michigan, those really low fertility northern Michigan soils. And like, for example, we have some people that have planted like in western Iowa, they've planted Big Rock and Tecumseh, like the RC Tecumseh and the RC Big Rock,
Mhm.
and the RC, and they got drought, and they got the RC Tecumseh to like 5, 6 feet tall the first year. And
Wow.
they
Okay.
and they said, like, the Big Rock looks like it was a year behind because it's a Midwest variety. And in time, that Big Rock has evolved and come along in at that site in western Iowa, but it was about a year behind. So if you've got a really low fertility soil in northern Michigan, put some Tecumseh in there and put some Big Rock together.
Okay. Would you say like a 50-50 mix or
Yeah.
okay.
Here's a question for you, Roger. If you have a slightly established stand, year one, year two, what are you doing to that stand to get it to improve? Or are you again letting it go and not babysitting it?
Well, I think it depends on the site. And if you've got a compacted soil, your expectations have got to be like just be patient and let those roots penetrate that compacted soil. So if you get a drought and you got a compacted soil, yeah, just be patient and don't try to like think you're going to add fertilizer and goose it because it's just going to grow weeds.
Gotcha.
So I think you need to really understand the situation you're in. And I would say the biggest mistake people make is they kill it with kindness, more herbicides, putting fertilizer on, mowing it to death. Just let it go for the most part. Like, go easy on the herbicides. You can use herbicides, but don't up the rates beyond label rates, you know? And respect if it's like hot, dry situation, you're going to stress the crap out of your switchgrass if you spray a herbicide on a stressed crop. So I think part of it's just getting people's skills up a little bit and they understand it. But our situation is we don't like to see people mow it, and we don't like to see people put too much herbicide on. Let the genetics work for you.
Patience, it sounds like, is the virtue on growing
Yeah,
switchgrass.
yeah, and make sure you put enough seed out there. Like some people are saying like 4 to 5 pounds per acre is the way to go. Well, yeah, if you got an ideal soil, if you're an experienced switchgrass grower, if you got a great drill, if you're in an area that gets good rains, Well, it can work, but largely people need to look at about a 6 to 10 pound range. And if you don't have if you have a less than best scenario, go into the higher range. And if you know what you're doing, you're an experienced, person with growing switchgrass, you can go into that 6 pound range. But put enough seed out there so you don't have to worry about too much weed competition and come back with $60 an acre quinclorac.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there what rates would you recommend for these newer varieties, like a bedding type situation versus a screen, maybe on a roadside? I used to be like what 6 to 8 for the former and 8 to 10 for the latter, the roadside. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the if you're in a screening situation, it's not a big area, and you got more. Sometimes you're up against a bush.
Hmm.
Sometimes you're getting more competition along the edges. Just put out enough seed there to make sure you got your stand. So some people put out 10 to 12 pound per acre, and they just walk away from it and don't even spray herbicides if it's a small area. So that can be done. And on the bedding side, like there's a myth out there that low seeding rates will prevent the sand from thickening. Well, low seeding rates on corn prevent the stand from thickening. But this is a perennial crop. And to think you can control Mother Nature, you can't. And so if you put fire to that switchgrass, you'll double the thickness of the switchgrass on average. Double it. So all of a sudden you burned it twice. And what have you got? You've got a switchgrass stand that reaches what? Something called tiller equilibrium. In other words, you don't, there's a sort of a productivity of that site driven by moisture and nutrients that allow a certain number of stems per square yard to evolve. So on a productive site, you'll get more stems per square meter. On a low fertility site, you'll get less stems per square meter. But if you put out 12 pound per acre, over time, it's going to reach the same tiller equilibrium as the guy that planted 4 pounds per acre and struggled with weeds at the beginning. So we tell people to look at about an 8 pound per acre seeding rate, and it's going to evolve to the same thickness regardless. So I like the idea of de-risking a little bit and reducing the rates of herbicides. And that 6 to 10 pound range is, I think, pretty useful guide. And
Yeah.
there's no blanket statement that plant 9 pounds per acre. It depends on the situation, and just try to adjust to what you think your situation is.
Okay, that makes sense. And are there any tips or tricks to keeping some of the RC or some of the newer varieties from laying down in a heavier snow load? I've seen you discuss that online recently and with the seeding rates, etc. So maybe along a road, again, we're talking about this screen along a road, maybe you're getting some snow load and it's laying down. What are your thoughts on how to manage that?
Well, the simplest way to work on the laying down or the lodging, as we call it, is just plant the variety that gets the tallest with the thickest stem. So if you get an ice storm on poplars, which poplars go down?
Sure.
It's not the 6 inchers. It's the young ones that are alongside the trail. They break over. Well, it's the same thing with switchgrass. The big rock is about a 25 to 30% thicker stem than Caven rock. So it doesn't break over. And like for me, I'm really pleased when somebody puts up a second-year picture of RC Big Rock in an ice storm, and it's holding. It's not collapsing. So that's the easiest, simplest thing is just plant a thick stem variety like RC Big Rock if you're in an upland growing area. And if you're in the south, you can use a lowland switchgrass in mixture with like an RC Big Rock, and that's going to be great standability. Like if you're in a place like Kentucky. So that's the simplest thing to do. And that for farmers or people with seed drills, you can tape over the bottom of the drill with duct tape every third run, and that'll give you what we call the twin row system. And that allows the snow to fall in between a little bit,
Okay.
especially if you orient it towards the direction of the prevailing wind. So if you planted east-west twin row RC Big Rock, that's about the best you can do in Michigan.
That's a great tip. And you would still go RC, or would you blend it with the Tecumseh for the northern Michigan?
No, like you have to use a variety that's adapted to your area. You could use Tecumseh in northern Michigan, especially the Upper Peninsula. But if I was drilling, I would plant Big Rock throughout the 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 rest of Michigan.
In the twin row system. That's a good tip.
Well, our seed growers all use that system.
That's
And
awesome.
and we just saw that less lodging. And like there's nothing worse than running a combine over a lodged crop.
Sure. Sure. How wide would you make a screen with the RC Big Rock? What's your thoughts on that? Minimum width.
Well, I would say like minimum width is 10 feet.
Okay.
And ideally you'd go 12 to 15. And especially if you're going up against the bush, I think then you want to go wider because you're facing a severe competition from the forest for water and shade. So you probably want to go at least 20 feet in that area. And there was a video we posted on our Facebook site, Switchgrass for Habitat, about planting switchgrass beside like winter conifers, for thermal cover, because the switchgrass traps the snow. And so your snow doesn't go into your conifer thermal cover where you want your deer. So you got two functions. One function is, improved security from that wall of switchgrass. But then you've got a winter function of snow trapping. So the deer can actually use your conifer thermal cover area.
I like that. And it relates to my next question. If you don't just have a monoculture of switchgrass and you have pockets of woody browse in there or coniferous trees, how are you managing that stand? You're not going to run fire through it, obviously. So what's another way to handle that?
Well, if the simplest thing to do is put food plots in there, embed the food plots, put the food in the bedroom, the refrigerator in the bedroom story. Like that's a great strategy. Switchgrass is all about security. And if you embed your food plot in the switchgrass, like, wow, it's going to bring a deer in. And they'll make their own trails through the existing material around it. And then you can do these pockets, and have like natural regeneration in those pockets. And if you wanted to, you could just harvest everything in the spring and sell it to a livestock farmer for bedding. Another option is just mow it. You don't have to burn it every year. But if you did want to burn, you could mow the areas around your pockets, okay, with a mower, mow maybe like a 25 or 30-foot strip. And then your risk of fire taking out your woody browse material is very low. So I think there's options. People just got to think about it and get experience. You can plant like herbaceous mixes in there as well that aren't going to burn. So, but I think like the whole idea of the switchgrass monoculture and the people calling it like a deer desert, like that's pretty old news. Like everybody knows you don't do that. I'm trying to find a good term, like the proper term. Like I've done some wildlife studies in agricultural systems, how to encourage wildlife in agriculture. And the term that everybody uses is you got to create landscape heterogeneity. Now that's a pretty big word, a couple of big words together, landscape heterogeneity. In other words, it's sort of like diversity in the landscape. So different landscape types, and let the animals choose where they want to go. Because you got to have a 4-season system. You don't want to talk about three seasons, especially if you're dealing with something like birds, like quail. So you got to think about all the different seasons. And in Michigan, you got to think about your winter thermal cover. So you need your conifer thermal areas. And then you need perennial and annual food plots. And then you need your native warm season grasses. And there's only one that really stands well in Michigan, and that's switchgrass, because the other ones all, when they get old, they break over at the nodes, and the nodes rot, and the big blue stem goes boom.
Okay.
So we're working on breeding big blue stem that stands better, but it's a long job. but we can get it through the hunting season, but I'm not sure if we can get it through the winter as well as switchgrass. So yeah, it's about creating, I would call, avoiding what we would call configurational monocultures. So don't plant your 100 acres into conifer thermal cover. You got to diversify. Don't put it all in. Like, there's nothing that drives me more crazy than the guys with these giant food plots that are waiting there to hammer the deer over the giant food plot, and they can't understand why there's no big bucks. And they did spend all this money, built up this beautiful thing, not a weed in the field, and the big bucks are not there when they want to hit them. So you've got to create like this diversity in your system, and the more screening you can put in, the safer it is for the animals. So, like, one of the things I learned when I did these wildlife studies in agriculture was you need to recognize that all animals prioritize security ahead of ease of feeding. So you
Yep.
don't set a great big table with no security. So,
Yep.
making your food plots like about a half acre or less and screening them with switchgrass, you're gonna have more daytime bucks and more animals out there because they feel more secure.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. Is there anything else that you would do besides conifers to help encourage or manipulate switchgrass field planting to encourage more wildlife use? So we got
Well,
food plots, we got some thermal cover trees, or anything else you
yeah.
would in
Well, I
there?
guess the big one is the edge feathering.
Mm,
And that's like you really can't do better than like switchgrass, edge feathering, and then in another part of your property put in some winter thermal cover. But yeah, I think this edge feathering is pretty nice. And I've worked in the bush when I was young. My family had property in northern New Brunswick, and my first job was cutting forest, and that's a big job, and not that safe a job. And doing the edge feathering, I think, is a pretty good deal because those trees are going to go out into the field, and you're getting the results. So and I like the edge feathering.
yeah, that's a great idea. So if you have a plain switchgrass field, you can put food plots through there, you could mow trails and paths, you could edge feather, you could plant
Yeah,
trees.
yeah, and if you plant like a native wildflower and native grass mix and have like 50 acres of it, you're no better off than you are with switchgrass as far as deer goes, because like you don't have the cover. They're not. There's no screening that's going to hold up during the late fall hunt. So I'm a big believer in like not an either or choice, and that you can do both.
Yeah.
And like, it's old news, these guys that are calling deer deserts for switchgrass, like that's just old. That's just it's just for me, it's just old.
Yeah, I'm sure you have a lot of these conversations, right? So you
Well, I
probably
just
hear
think,
stuff like that all the
well, it
time.
just drives me nuts, these blanket statements. So
Yeah.
if you have somebody like that's in the far north, you know, yeah, switchgrass is no big deal. It's just another option for bedding. But if you're in an ag zone and you got food galore and you got no forests around, like, switchgrass is a no-brainer. Like, you just are holding all the animals. We see it in our switchgrass fields when we're harvesting them with combines. You'll have a dozen deer in the field, even if it's 50 acres, and the big bucks will be bounding through it. Like, the switchgrass never gets so thick that the big buck wouldn't go into it. Like, that's another myth.
That
You know,
was the next question I was going to ask you right there, because that was always been the thing that I've been pushed is you got to put pockets in because it's too thick for the deer to go through.
well, they've done the studies on deer, and what they find is that when gun season starts, they deliberately shorten the sight lines of where they're exposed. Okay, so they know something's going on, and the big does and the big bucks will always find more security, shorten the sight lines during the hunt, and so that's when they're going to use the switchgrass. Like, we have like 10-point bucks in tall switchgrass during the hunt, and where did those daytime bucks go? Well, they went where there's the most, they're least observed, and they're not going to spend the whole year there. They're gonna spend that gun season there. They're going to spend time there in the in daytime. So then, if you put some food plots in there, then they can use those during the day for their daytime browse, and go out into the ag fields in the evening.
Makes total sense.
Are there
Well,
any other? Oh, go ahead.
No, I just say, like, there's a lot of really brilliant practitioners out there that have so much experience, and just the wisdom is there. And if you just like listen to them, and you understand the basics, like, it kind of makes sense. Michigan, you got Hunter Joe. I found him on the Facebook sites, and I said, this guy's just a genius. He's been at it forever. He's made all these observations. He's got beautiful animals in the daytime on his property. And he's got a pretty simple system. He's got the mast, from the forest, and then he's got perennial and annual food plots. He's got his winter thermal cover, and he's got a switchgrass. And it kind of works, you know?
I was just going to
Absolutely.
ask you what like one of the best properties that you've seen around would consist of using switchgrass, and you kind of just named it. So
Yeah, I think Hunter Joe's a great guy, and he's very helpful and accommodating to people around, providing information and stuff. In Minnesota, there's Sam Tumberg,
he's been on.
and yeah, and another guy I quite like in Kansas is Dave Weber,
Okay.
and he's a quail enthusiast, and he also is into the pheasants and deer, but like he's been at it for 30 years, and he's got the best built up property, I think, for biodiversity.
Cool.
Yeah. So, my background is learning from practitioners, and trying to get those practitioners to share information. So we go into a brutal area in West Africa where there's terrible productivity, and we brainstorm with the best and brightest farmers, and they all come up with strategies, and we implement those strategies, and everybody learns. So the beauty of Michigan is that you guys are at the top end in terms of like long-term practitioners on managing deer on small properties.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah, and so really like to me the big thinkers and the guys that always win the switchgrass competitions are in Michigan.
That's
So
some
no-
promising information right there.
Yeah, no excuses then, guys. So. Oh, Roger, any other myths that we may have missed? I want to be respectful of your time and wrap this up here soon, but anything that you feel like we need to hit today before we shut this down?
Well, I think we did pretty good. We kind of covered the territory. You know, if people have any questions about stuff about specifically, they could visit our Facebook site, Switchgrass for Habitat, and Hunter Joe's on there as a moderator, and there's other people out there, and we have 24,000 on the site now,
Wow.
and we started like little over 2.5 years ago, and so it's come up quite nicely because it's an area that not many people have covered on their on those Facebook sites. They tend to be more food plot oriented, and not oriented enough on the security side. And some people put up their plans, and people give feedback on how to fix the plans or if they think it's a good one. So I think we're all in learning mode together. And these podcasts are really helpful to learn. Like I've watched some of your podcasts of some of the leading practitioners, and I think you're doing really well getting the diversity of people on these podcasts.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You're one of the guys, so we're gonna have more diversity here on the grass side of things, and I would echo that group of yours on Facebook. That's a great group and resource to go join.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming in and having a chat this morning.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
I hope everybody has good deer survival in Michigan this winter, and things don't get crazy like they can.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much, Roger. Have a great day. Thanks for your time. And if anybody wants to reach out to Roger, check out that group on Facebook. Anywhere else you want to plug, Roger, before we wrap this up?
Well, I just think that uh, the only message I have is it's all about the results, and you know, that's where you want to go for the results. And we're quite pleased with how our switchgrasses have been received in the market. And you know, it's really nice when people talk that they've got their best results ever. So thanks again, gentlemen.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Roger.
Cheers.